Hey, well, good evening, First Baptist Prattville. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's edition of Table Talk. Table Talk has been a multi-week commitment of sitting down with friends and co-laborers in the gospel to have conversations about life and mission and ministry. And tonight, I'm so excited to have my neighbor, my
Yes.
friend, my brother in Christ, Ken Johnson, a family man and an ordained pastor in the United Methodist Church, and a chaplain in the United States Air Force
Yes.
stationed right here in Prattville in the Montgomery area. So glad that you're here tonight.
It's good to be
Thanks so
here.
much.
It's good
Yeah.
to be here. Yeah.
So Ken, almost every week we have these table talks,
Sure.
and we try to have a theme, a concept that we want to talk through.
Sure.
A lot of people have been isolated at home.
Yep.
Now, not so much. A lot of people are out and about,
Yep.
but still a lot of online content. And so
Yeah.
we're just trying to provide some really helpful, thoughtful conversations. And so you would pretty much have to have your head in the sand to miss what's happening currently in our nation. And I know that we could have a conversation about the fact that the current racial tensions have been going on really for generations and generations. But as often happens, it seems like every few months or once or twice every couple of years, with the gruesome killing of yet another African American, George Floyd, and then, of course, before him, Ahmaud and others, it's now at the forefront of our thinking.
Yeah.
And so I just want to acknowledge that I am first and foremost a follower of Jesus. I totally uphold and value the image of God in all people, regardless of skin color. But I also realize that as a white man, I've always, 100% of the days of my life, lived in a majority culture.
Yeah.
And so because of that, I don't always understand. And so tonight, because I love you
Yeah.
and we're friends
Yes.
and neighbors and our families know each other, I just wanted to maybe model what it looks like to have
Yeah.
maybe an uncomfortable conversation and mutually encourage and help one another.
Sure.
So thanks for being here.
It's good to be here. It's
Yeah,
good to be here.
I'm really grateful. So why don't you take a second before we
Yes.
dive into the
Sure.
meat. Tell us about your family.
Yeah. So I have I'm married. I have three beautiful children. One that just turned 21.
You're an old man.
I am an old man. I am an old man. But I still, feel like I'm 21, or
That's
I
right.
think I'm 21.
That's right.
But I have a 16-year-old daughter as well. She's being homeschooled, and a 10-year-old son, and he is being homeschooled. And so we have lived in all kinds of parts of the country. We've lived in very diverse environments, and we are unique too, in a way, because we are an interracial family. I am proud of my family. My oldest
Yeah.
daughter, she's in nursing school, and she is doing absolutely well. She's about to graduate in about a year. So she's about to move on. I've been trying to get her out of the house for some time, and she keeps coming back. When she
I
turns,
hear they do that.
yeah, they do. When they turn 18 years old, you think they're gonna go out and just kind of do their thing and never come back. And
Right.
so she's back, and part of that's COVID-19.
Yeah,
right?
that's true. That's true. So, man, we love getting to be
Yeah,
neighbors
sure.
with y'all, and
Absolutely,
so excited
likewise.
about the friendship. So,
Mhm.
so pretty soon after
Mm-hmm.
the video was released about the just horrible brutality at the hands of white policemen that took the life of George Floyd, I immediately found myself hurting, sad, confused, worried, worried that I'm going to say too much, worried I'm not going to say enough, worried that my African American friends are not going to want to talk to me now, worried that they want me. So I didn't know what to do. So I just picked up the phone and began to call some African American friends, including you.
Yes.
Which resulted in a long conversation that really encouraged me and taught me a lot, and resulted into me asking if you would come. And so the first question I asked then, and I'll ask you now,
Sure.
as an African American man who loves Jesus, who seeks to serve Jesus, this is what you do
Yes.
for a life.
Yeah.
Like, how are you feeling? How are you processing all that's happening right now?
Yeah, so I think part of the feeling is consistent with what I've always felt, because these are stories that I heard growing up, of racial injustice, So there's kind of a numbing that I think some people in particular communities like African American communities feel. There's a sense that, oh, this is just another story. Not just another story in the sense that it doesn't matter, but it feels like it's typical. And so part of it is, okay, here we go again. This is another story. That was the initial feeling that I had, and I think part of that feeling is that these are things that we continually see in the media, and I think media has a part in this because the way in which media frames these stories sometimes can put gasoline on the fire. And so, that was part of the feeling as well. How much of this is media invoked, and do we immediately know that this was a racial incident? And I think, and I don't want to speak on behalf of all African Americans and African American communities, but there seems to be a suspicion whenever there's an incident like this. Immediately, there's an assumption that this is racially motivated. And so I think for me, growing up with the stories and hearing about the experiences of my father and my grandfather, my grandmother, you almost run to that conclusion that this is a racial incident. So that was my immediate. Yeah.
So I don't want to necessarily pick at an old wound, but
Sure.
something that you said, honestly, I just never thought about. So would you mind just sharing, again, if you're comfortable,
Yeah, sure.
maybe an incident, maybe not necessarily in detail, but maybe an incident that you grew up always hearing about from a grandparent or a parent, or maybe an instruction you received
Sure.
training you as a young boy, that honestly, as a white man with white parents and white grandparents, that I might not that relating in my family, I can't even fathom. Would
Sure,
you
yeah,
mind
yeah.
sharing that?
So, as it relates to George Floyd and policing, I grew up in a time where, I grew up in a very healthy household, and so my father was a pastor, my mother worked at the university, and very educated, but at the same time, there was still this sense that uh, I have to be extra careful when I'm in public. So if I were to be pulled over by the police, my father instructed me, this is what you do. And so some of the things that you hear in the media today about, African American parents instructing their children how to engage with police, these are things that were taught to me many, many years ago. You need to make sure you look it in the eye, yes, sir, no, ma'am, those kinds of things, because there was this sort of imminent fear that something would happen, that you would be shot, or there would be some kind of police brutality if you were engaged improperly with the police. And so there was this level of anxiety. So I was taught those things. I was taught that you're going to have to work a lot harder as an African American male because there are certain stigmas and stereotypes about black people that white people had. And so you're going to have to prove yourself a little bit more. You're going to have to work a little bit harder to gain access into certain environments. And so the way you talk and the way you dress and the way you carry yourself, these are things. Now, on one hand, these are also values that are taught, not regardless of whether you are white or black. And growing up, I realized that because I knew the history and I understood the story, that everyone had to, my best friend who was white, who lived across the street, they were taught the same values. And so I had to begin to think about, okay, so why was Dad, encouraging these particular values in this way, that I would have to work harder, that I would have to, the first impression was I was black, and then, the rest is you have to prove yourself in certain environments. And I realized that he came from a history of segregation, and his parents came from segregation, Jim Crow laws, that affected him. And so some of those values were tainted and kind of instilled into me to this day. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I think one thing when you're sharing that I was thinking about is growing up in Mississippi.
Sure.
A lot of history of not only a lot of practices that happen around Jim Crow, but my parents taught me to value all human life, regardless of color, and that had been instilled into them by their parents.
Sure.
My mom grew up in Memphis. My dad grew up in a rural North Mississippi town. But to think that my grandparents somewhat talked about how even though life was segregated, they never devalued necessarily
Mm-hmm.
an African American man or woman.
Right.
When you talk to your grandparents, like they knew what it was like to be told you can't go here,
Right.
you can't go there, and
Mm-hmm.
that differently informs you than it
Mm-hmm.
does me. Just the way that our family histories have
Mm-hmm.
dictated, which I find just amazing how kind of our past shapes that. So, okay, so let's fast forward kind of to now. The video surfaced. Obviously, there have been peaceful protests
Mm-hmm.
that, as Americans, we are pro, but then there have also been rioting and violence
Mm-hmm.
on the part of all kind of colors, and
Yeah.
I know we would both, because we've talked about this,
Sure.
would totally condemn that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think there are a lot of Christians that are wanting to know, okay, what do we do? And so
Yeah.
you've got some that are like jumping to one side that, it's a radical whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have others that are just saying, all we need is Jesus. And like I'm pro Jesus. I know
Yes.
you're pro
Yes.
Jesus. But like the Bible, we were talking about this
Sure.
before we went on the air, is the Bible speaks a lot about racial injustices.
Mm-hmm.
And, in Galatians 2, it is recorded in Holy Scripture that the Apostle Paul went full tilt at the Apostle Peter
Mm-hmm.
for a racist behavior
Yeah.
of putting a barrier between Gentiles and Jews.
Yes.
And Paul condemned Peter and rebuked him, saying, you ought to know better.
Yeah.
So, yes, it is Jesus, but if we're following Jesus, that ought to result in action.
Mm-hmm.
So, help me know as a white brother
Mm-hmm.
in Christ, here's some actions, here's some steps I encourage you to take. Here's how you can love your African American neighbor well.
Sure. So, this is something that we're doing in my community. So, we all have these sort of eco centers that we belong to.
Yeah.
There's the church in our society, there's our job, and then there's the places that we live, and then there's our hobbies and things like that. And typically what happens is people will stay in their eco chambers, and
Yeah.
the media that we listen to, the people that we talk to, the people that we have a relationship with, a lot of those conversations reinforce the way we think,
Yeah.
and the way we think about the situation. And so, even, there's this conversation about Facebook and social media and these algorithms. The more you click on a particular subject, you'll get fed more of
Yeah.
that same subject and that particular political bend. And so one of the things that I encourage people to do is, like what we're doing, is having a conversation about it. And to do that is to step outside of your echo chamber where you're comfortable and you're forced to grow. Comfort and growth, don't go together. You have to be uncomfortable in order to grow. And so in order for you to grow, you have to step outside of your comfort zone. In this case, your those centers of gravity that are particular to who you are, and kind of force yourself to have that conversation, force yourself to be uncomfortable. For example, in my family, we have many views on this topic, and my wife, she's back home with the family now, and they have different views on the subject, and different than my views, and it's not all bad. They're great views, and they're great points, but the point is that we're having this conversation, and in a way, because we're family, we're forced to have this conversation. And a lot of people are not, I shouldn't say a lot of people are not, but I'm encouraging people to step outside of their comfort zones to have these sit-down conversations that are very uncomfortable to have.
Yeah.
In this day and age, the conversation is not just, I think part of it is COVID-19 because people can't really, social distancing, but even on Facebook and the comments that are made, helping people to understand the other side, providing a resource or a book or a video that kind of explains a different point of view, and I think that will help. I think that's part of it is listening. It starts with just hearing. I know what I think,
Yeah.
but I want to know what you think.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's good. Galatians 6:2, the Spirit inspires Paul to say, brothers, bear one another's burdens,
Yes.
and in doing so, you fulfill the law of Christ. Well, what is the law of Christ? To love God, to love your neighbor as yourself. And so, how do we love our neighbor? Well, it's to bear one another's burdens.
Absolutely.
And so, I think one thing that I want my white brothers and sisters to see and to hear, and of course, not just white folks, but because that is my skin tone. I feel like I'm uniquely positioned to speak to them. Is like you can have some opinions, and you may not understand why somebody may say Black Lives Matter. They're not saying that white lives don't matter or that blue lives don't matter. They're not saying that. They're saying we all agree that these lives matter, but we can't say all lives matter until Black Lives Matter. And of course, there's controversial opinions, and I understand those things. But to be able to say, look, as followers of Jesus, we can differ. Like you were saying, you and your wife differ. We can differ, but we can listen, and we can bear one another's burdens, and we don't have to go nuts on a social media post of saying it's a liberal agenda or a right-wing conservative conspiracy. No, we can just listen and learn and hopefully push one another and let iron sharpen iron. So, so there's so many questions. It's still a little time, but so obviously you serve the U.S. Air Force, and so all day, every day, you are ministering to people of color and people of light skin and people that speak different, accents and part of different country. So tell me, how do you approach this sense of modeling what it looks like to love others and to listen, to have unity when you have a position in which you are ministering to such a diverse group of people?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. So, first of all, I think it's important that we consider our circles of influence. We all have circles of influence, and even if you think you don't, you do. And, as pastor of this church, you have a larger influence than maybe some people do. But a lot of people think, well, what do I do? I just work, as a waitress, or, there are many ways in which we can do something about it, and we have to figure out what that is. And so for me, in my job, we're having these conversations. And some of those conversations are forced conversations because we need to have this conversation in order to get the mission done, because we don't want there to be the kind of conflicts, internal conflicts that interfere with getting the job done, for our nation. But so what we're doing is we're having these sit-down small group conversations, and there are many different, as you mentioned, personalities, different backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, and which makes our job a little bit more difficult, I think, than some places, because everybody has a different opinion, and you can see the posts online. But we tend to focus on what is common. We bleed the same, and at the end of the day, we love each other. And but it all begins with having that conversation and awareness that how do I belong in this community? How do I fit in? And I think that's part of the larger kind of conversation. And then when you start to talk about race or any other subject that may exclude or make someone feel excluded, it opens people's eyes to say, "Oh, I had no idea." We want everyone to feel like they belong. And so I think there's a humanity piece in there, that you have to have a love for people. And I think most people do. I don't think the world is all evil. I think most people, we love our family, we have great values, we want our communities to thrive. But I think part of that is understanding that, the black community is our community. the white community is our community. And like you said, if one community or sub-community or echo chamber suffers, then we all suffer. That's kind of how we look at it,
Yeah.
I think, in the Air Force. If one unit is suffering, then how does that impact the overall mission? In our case, in our sense, if the city of Prattville is suffering, then the state of Alabama is suffering. And we have to look at it like that, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And I think the comparison to the U.S. Air Force is so helpful because as a church we have a very clear mission, right? To glorify God by making much of Jesus, by making disciples of all nations, and that when we are focused on the mission, then we're going to pursue unity at all costs.
Yeah.
And whenever we're not allowing there to be unity, when we're not pursuing unity, we're not focusing on the mission suffers. And so I think, so last question, because again, man, we could go all day.
We can go all day, yes, absolutely.
We could. And we're friends, so it's like, it's so easy. So, tell me this. So for the person that would say, hey, but if the church gets super involved in these issues, then the church is going liberal. Then the church is going social gospel. They're losing the gospel. The church is supposed to be about the death, resurrection of Jesus, which we agree with. Right. But what would you say about, actually the gospel does impact our view on these things. What would you kind of say as we conclude about how the Bible and specifically the gospel speaks to our current cultural moment?
So as a Christian believer, it's all spiritual. As a believer of Christ, our job is to leverage the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven on earth as it is in heaven.
Yeah.
That's what Jesus talked about when he instructed his disciples about how to pray. And so when we think about this coming kingdom, it is the idea of what heaven is going to look like, and this new earth and this new heaven will replace this old earth and the old heaven. So there's this sort of eschatological, I hate to use a huge word there, but you know what I'm talking about.
You're dropping that theology word. I like it.
But the idea is that this coming kingdom that's coming, we are part of that kingdom, and the Christian believer is part of this kingdom to come. And so our job is to usher in what this kingdom looks like. And if you're not involved in the humanity of people, if you're not involved in the issues that surrounds our community, then what does the gospel mean? What is the impact of the gospel if all we're doing is feeling comfortable in church and singing songs and listening to sermons that tickle our ears?
Yeah.
And the Bible talks about that too in Revelations, right? The lukewarm church.
Yeah.
And
not in an encouraging way.
Not in an encouraging way, right? Yeah. There's the images that I will spit you out kind of thing. And so, everything is spiritual. Everything that we touch. When you become a believer of Jesus Christ, your job then, your purpose is all about the kingdom to come. It's about ushering the kingdom. And so I'm leveraging everything that I have, everything that I own, everything that I do, my profession, for this kingdom to come. Yeah. That's our job. Yeah. And sometimes politics does get into it a little bit, a lot for a lot of people, and it replaces the gospel.
Yeah.
Sometimes our interpretations becomes, the gospel, and it's not the transcendent God, Jesus. So I would say that it's all important, and I would challenge anyone about their own sense of comfort. Because if you are comfortable, I would challenge and I would even question, is Jesus even active in your life and in your heart? Because Christ makes us uncomfortable.
Yeah.
If you're not being convicted by something, then are we doing it right as believers?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Well, Ken, I realized that you did not have to come, and
man, this
you
is
didn't have
great.
to have this conversation, but I'm really grateful that you did.
Absolutely.
And a lot of people at our church know you because they're active in the
Yes.
Air Force, and then a lot of them have served alongside of you for
Sure.
different events that you guys have done on base. And so we're really grateful for you,
Thank you.
for your ministry. So glad that you and your family are Prattville, and selfishly, I'm glad that you're my neighbor.
Yes, me too.
And so
Yes.
really grateful for that. And next time we go for a run, though, I need to go a little slower.
Okay. Okay.
Just a little slower. We were going too fast.
Okay.
No, I'm kidding.
Absolutely.
Hey, well, thanks so much for being a part of Table Talk tonight. These are hard conversations, and there's so much more that can be said. And again, we're not trying to lift up a political ideology or a political person. We're simply trying to ask, how does the gospel speak into the way that we value every human being and the way that we love our neighbor as ourselves, and specifically during this current incident. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next week for Table Talk at 6 o'clock.